And joining me now to dig deeper into some of the most pertinent global economic issues is our featured thinker, Peter Blair Henry. He's the author of Turnaround, Third World Lessons for the First World Growth. And he's also Dean at NYU Stern School of Business. Peter, thanks for joining us tonight. We're going to start off following on from Karina's report about colleges and the courses that they offer. Now, many colleges or business schools in particular have been accused of focusing too much on theory and not enough on the practical lessons. Yet you say that there is a false dichotomy between theory and practice.
There's a lot to learn from theory, in particular if we want to take advantage of the new opportunities for growth around the globe. So a good example would be emerging markets. Understanding that what's transforming emerging markets in particular is the fact that there's a huge process of urbanization underway, not only in China, but in countries in the Middle East and in Africa, and that's going to represent a big business opportunity. So understanding the theory of what's driving growth is key, in order to be able to seize the practical opportunities for growth, like urbanization.
Okay, so we learn the theory, but is there a concern that colleges are not giving enough of a practical lesson for when it comes to dealing with real-world situations?
Well, I think there has to be balance. I think there has to be a foundation in understanding the forces that are driving the world. But then, of course, we want our students to get out in the world and to put those theories against the realities that are out there to make sure that they know how to do things.
Well, one of the realities is that U.S. markets have been on an absolute tear. Both the S&P 500 and the Dow hitting fresh closing highs, well, basically every day this week. And you have said that policymakers can actually look to the markets to see if their policies are in fact having an impact. And many have argued that there is a disconnect between the real economy and the markets, and that the markets were in fact partly to blame for the financial crisis, yet you say policymakers should be watching the markets to see how their reforms are taking shape.
Yes, so two points of distinction to make. One is, right now, the markets have been doing a lot better, and that's because we're in a relatively more calm economic environment. But it's important to remember that markets are still nowhere near the highs that we saw in 2007 once you adjust for inflation.
Right.
But the key point that for policymakers is if we actually look at how markets in developing countries, for instance, responded to big policy changes that are being considered right now as options for advanced countries. Look at how, for instance, stock markets in developing countries responded when they implemented fiscal austerity in the 1970s and 1980s. You learn very quickly that austerity only works when countries are suffering from high inflation. In moderate inflation environments like we have right now in the United States, in Western Europe, and Britain, austerity is not the way to go.
Well, austerity, a big word when it comes to the European Union, with Greece and Spain being forced into austerity packages. You're arguing that this is not the way to stimulate growth, and you bring up Barbados as an example. Tell us more about that particularly.
Yes. So the key lesson from the third world is that discipline does not mean fiscal austerity. Discipline means doing what's necessary for the country to grow. Barbados has some important parallels to modern day Europe. Barbados was suffering from an uncompetitive labor environment. Mm-hmm. Wages had risen too fast relative to productivity, just like in Southern Europe. The government there convened the private sector, the unions, and leaders to get together to negotiate a wage cut that would restore productivity. And what's really key there is Barbados had a fixed exchange rate with the United States in the same way that Southern Europe is fixed relative to Germany.
Well, isn't a wage cut like an austerity package? I mean, that's been part of the packages that Europe's been forced to take on. Well,
the key thing is what's the discipline doesn't mean that you don't do anything that's tough. But the question is, are you just doing kind of across the board fiscal austerity that's sort of indiscriminate?
So a more targeted austerity approach.
Exactly. Targeting the key measure, the key instrument that you need in order to generate jobs and productivity. In this case, wages.
Now, the other lesson you say that we need to learn from the emerging world is trust. What does that mean?
Trust is really key because countries have to understand that this is not a zero-sum game. In the world economy, in an integrated world economy, we all win or we all lose, and we have to work together in order for that to happen. A great example would be thinking about IMF reform. The IMF in 2010 voted to give emerging markets a bigger say in the global economy. The BRICS account for 21% of global growth, but only 11.5% of the votes at the IMF. But right now, the U.S. Congress has held up those reforms for the last 2 years. So that undermines trust, and we see that trust being undermined when we see the BRICS, as they met last month, voting to begin to set up their own small monetary institutions.
And we don't want these isolated groups because the global economy is more interlinked than ever before.
Exactly right, exactly right.
Which brings us to your third lesson, which is clarity.
Yeah, so clarity. Let's go back to the example of Barbados. No one likes to have their wages cut, as you said earlier. In the case of Barbados, when the government negotiated that wage cut, as a result of that, the prime minister and his party were voted out of office for 14 years.
Something European politicians don't want.
Yeah, exactly. But the key thing, the country recovered. They got out of financial crisis. And when the Prime Minister Sandiford was asked, would he do it again? He said, my loss in the election, my loss of power was a small price to pay in order to save the country. That's the kind of leadership, the kind of clarity that we need in order for the world economy to move forward.
Well, I'm not sure every politician would risk his own position for the greater good, but hopefully they'll read your book and follow suit. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Peter Blair Henry, author of Turnaround, Third World Lessons for First World Growth, and also Dean at the NYU Stern School of Business.